I fixed an alien's engine, and in return, he revealed Jesus. What I found will change your faith forever. I need you to understand something before I tell you what happened that night in the desert. I was a man who had stopped believing in miracles. My hands knew only grease and metal, the stubborn language of broken things that could be fixed with wrenches and wire. I lived in a town so small it didn't have a name on most maps, just a scatter of buildings clinging to the edge of nothing, where the sky stretched wider than hope and the silence pressed against your chest like a hand. I worked alone in my garage, the only mechanic for 60 miles, fixing trucks and tractors for people who paid in cash or barter, who looked through me like I was already a ghost. My faith had died years ago, buried under disappointment and unanswered prayers, until I convinced myself that the universe was just machinery too cold, indifferent, running on laws that had no room for love. I had made peace with my smallness, with the idea that we spin alone in the dark, that consciousness is an accident and meaning is just a story we tell ourselves to sleep at night. But God had other plans, plans that would shatter my certainty like glass and rebuild me from the inside out. That midnight, I was closing up the garage when the sky tore open with a light that shouldn't exist, a luminescence that bypassed my eyes and burned directly into my soul. And I knew before I even understood what I was seeing that my life had just been split into before and after. The sound came first, not an explosion, but a hum that I felt in my teeth, in my bones, a frequency that made the air itself seem to vibrate with intention. I ran outside into the desert cold, my breath clouding in front of me, and there it was, a craft half buried in the sand about 200 yards from my garage, glowing with colors I don't have names for, shades that existed between the ones I'd known my whole life. The light pulsed like a heartbeat, steady and somehow organic, casting long shadows that moved wrong, that bent in directions shadows shouldn't bend. I should have been terrified, every instinct screaming at me to run, to hide, to pretend I'd seen nothing, but instead I felt pulled forward, drawn by something deeper than curiosity, as if every choice I'd ever made had been leading me to this exact moment. My boots crunched against the sand as I approached, each step feeling heavier and lighter at the same time, the way I imagine walking toward an altar must feel for those who still believe. The craft's surface was smooth but not metal, warm but not hot, and covered in symbols that seemed to shift when I looked at them directly, like they were being written and rewritten in real time. I circled it slowly, my mechanic's mind trying to make sense of the impossible geometry, the way it seemed larger inside than outside, the way it hummed with a life that machinery shouldn't have. Then I saw the opening, a seam of pure light that widened as I drew near, and I knew without being told that I was being invited in, that something inside was waiting, that this was a threshold I could cross but never uncross. My hand was shaking when I reached toward that light, not from fear but from the sudden, overwhelming certainty that I was about to touch the edge of something holy. Inside, the air tasted electric and sweet, like ozone mixed with something floral I couldn't place, and the walls glowed with a soft bioluminescence that made me think of deep ocean creatures I'd seen in documentaries. The space was circular, or maybe spherical. My depth perception kept failing, kept telling me I was seeing impossible distances in what should have been a confined area. Equipment lined the walls, crystalline structures that pulsed with inner light. Technology so far beyond my understanding that it felt more like art than engineering, more like prayer than science. And there, collapsed against what I somehow knew was the control nexus, was the being, the alien, the visitor, the angel. I still don't know what word does him justice. He was humanoid but not human, his limbs too long and graceful, his skin a shade between silver and pearl that seemed to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. His chest rose and fell in labored rhythm, and his eyes, God, his eyes when they found mine, they held such sorrow, such ancient sadness, that I felt my heart break for him before I even understood what I was seeing. There was intelligence there, and pain, and something else, recognition, as if he'd been waiting for me specifically, as if my face was one he'd seen before in dreams or prophecies. I dropped to my knees beside him without thinking, my hands hovering over his body, and I heard myself whisper, "What do you need? Tell me how to help you." And in that moment, kneeling in an impossible craft beside a dying creature from beyond the stars, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt like my life had purpose, like I was exactly where I was meant to be. His hand rose slowly, trembling with effort, and pointed toward the crystalline structure at the center of the craft, the engine. I realized, though it looked nothing like any engine I'd ever seen, It was fractured, dark veins spreading through its translucent surface like cracks in ice, and the light that should have been coursing through it was dim, dying, fading with each pulse. I moved toward it instinctively, my mechanic's instincts taking over even as my mind reeled from the impossibility of what I was attempting. As I reached out to touch it, heat flooded through my palms, not burning, but energizing, like touching a live wire made of pure potential, and suddenly I could see how it worked. Not with my eyes, but with some deeper perception I didn't know I possessed. The structure was both mechanical and organic, technology and biology fused into something that operated on principles that transcended both. And I understood with startling clarity that it ran not on fuel, but on intention, on consciousness itself, on a form of energy that human science hadn't discovered because it required belief to access. My hands moved without my conscious direction, guided by intuition or inspiration or something I can only call grace, realigning the crystalline matrices, channeling my own life force into the gaps, willing the fractured pieces to remember their wholeness. I prayed without meaning to, words spilling from my lips that I didn't choose. And as I did, the engine began to glow brighter, the cracks sealing themselves with threads of light that looked like stitches made of starlight. Behind me, I heard the being's breath deepen, strengthen, and when I turned back, he was sitting up, his eyes fixed on me with an expression of wonder that mirrored my own. He spoke then, his voice like music and thunder combined, resonating not just in my ears but in my entire being. And the word he said in perfect, unaccented English was one I never expected to hear: brother. The word brother hung in the air between us, impossible and intimate, and I felt something crack open inside my chest, not breaking, but opening, like a door I'd kept locked for so long I'd forgotten it was there. He rose to his feet with fluid grace, his movements no longer labored, and the light from the restored engine cast his features in a glow that made him look both alien and achingly familiar, like seeing a reflection of myself in a mirror made of stars. I stumbled backward, my legs weak, my mind trying to catalog and categorize what was happening while my heart simply stood in stunned silence. I don't understand, I managed to say, though even those words felt inadequate, too small for the enormity of this moment. He took a step toward me, and I noticed that his feet barely touched the ground, that he moved with a weightlessness that seemed to defy physics. And when he reached out his hand, I saw symbols glowing beneath his skin, constellations of meaning that pulsed in time with his heartbeat. "You saved my life," he said, and his voice carried harmonics that made me think of cathedral bells and wind through canyons. "But more than that, you recognized what this vessel truly is: a convergence of faith and form, spirit and science, the marriage that your people once knew but have forgotten." I stared at my own hands, still trembling from the work they'd done, still glowing faintly with residual light, and I wondered if I was losing my mind or finally finding it. "Who are you?" I asked, though what I really meant was, "What are you? Why are you here? And why does looking at you feel like remembering something I've never known?" He tilted his head, studying me with those luminous eyes that held galaxies in their depths, and I saw compassion there, the kind of infinite patience that only comes from having witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of suns. "My people have many names across many worlds," he said, "but what matters is not what we are called, but what we have seen. And we have seen your world, your species, since before you learned to make fire, since before you looked up at the stars and wondered if you were alone." His words settled over me like snow, each one crystallizing into understanding, and I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end as the implications cascaded through my consciousness. "You've been watching us," I whispered, and it wasn't a question, but a confirmation of something I'd always suspected in my deepest soul, that the universe was not empty, that the silence was not absence but waiting. He nodded slowly, and moved toward the wall of his craft, placing his hand against its surface, which rippled like water and became transparent, revealing the desert night beyond, and above it the vast tapestry of stars, more stars than I'd ever seen. "Despite living my whole life away from city lights, we watch many worlds," he said softly, "but yours we watch with special care, with hope and heartbreak, because you were given something rare, something most species never receive." "What was that?" I asked, moving to stand beside him, staring out at the infinite darkness punctuated by infinite light, feeling suddenly so small and yet somehow connected to all of it, part of a pattern I was only beginning to glimpse. He turned to face me fully then, and placed his hand over his chest, over where his heart would be if his biology matched mine, and said, You were visited by the Creator's own expression, by love made flesh, by the bridge between all that is physical and all that is eternal, the one you call Jesus, the one we call the cosmic Christ, the incarnation that changed not just your world, but the fabric of reality itself. The air left my lungs in a rush, and I gripped the edge of what I assumed was a console to steady myself, because this being, this traveler from beyond my comprehension, had just spoken the name that I'd spent years trying to forget, trying to dismiss, trying to bury under cynicism and disappointment. You know about Jesus, I said, and my voice cracked on the name. Decades of abandoned faith rising up like a tide I couldn't hold back. He smiled then, and it was the saddest, most beautiful expression I'd ever witnessed. A smile that held the weight of watching humanity stumble in darkness when light had been offered, of seeing love rejected by those who needed it most. Know of him, he said gently. We witnessed him, recorded him, understood perhaps better than your own kind did what he truly was, not a myth, not a moral teacher, not even merely a prophet, but an anchor point, a moment when the infinite compressed itself into the finite, when God reached through every dimension to touch yours directly. The walls around us began to shimmer and shift, and suddenly I wasn't standing in a craft anymore, but in a space between spaces, and he was showing me images that bypassed my eyes entirely, visions that appeared directly in my mind with a clarity that made ordinary memory seem like fog. I saw Earth from a distance, a blue jewel turning in the darkness, and I saw threads of light connecting it to other points in space, a web of consciousness and intention that spanned the cosmos. And at certain moments in history those threads blazed brighter, moments when prophets spoke or mystics touched the divine or saints performed miracles. But there was one point, one moment in time roughly 2,000 years ago, when the entire web ignited like a star going nova, when every thread connected to a single location in an unremarkable corner of the Roman Empire, in a region called Palestine. In a moment when something impossible happened, God became man, infinity became infant. The Word became flesh. I saw it not as metaphor, but as cosmic fact, as an event that registered across dimensions, that sent ripples through the fundamental structure of reality itself. And I understood with soul-deep certainty that Jesus was not just a teacher who died, and maybe rose again, but a transformation of what was possible, a recalibration of the relationship between Creator and creation, between spirit and matter, between love and law. Tears were streaming down my face, hot and unchecked, and I didn't wipe them away because they felt sacred, like my body's only adequate response to having my entire understanding of existence rewritten in an instant. Why are you showing me this? I managed to ask, my voice barely a whisper, and he placed his hand on my shoulder, and I felt warmth flood through me, not physical heat but the warmth of being known, of being seen, of being loved despite every failure and doubt and moment of despair. Because you need to know, he said, that your faith was never foolish, that your prayers were never unheard, and that the story you abandoned was truer than you dared to believe in, because the time is coming when your species must choose whether to remember or to forget forever what you are. The vision faded like morning mist, and I found myself back in the physical confines of the craft, my knees buckling beneath me as the weight of what I'd seen pressed down on my shoulders like the gravity of 1,000 worlds. He caught me before I fell, his grip surprisingly solid for someone who seemed to exist partially outside normal physics, and as his hand steadied me I felt a pulse of energy pass between us, not electric but alive, conscious, intentional, as though his very touch carried information my body could read even if my mind couldn't fully translate it. I don't understand how this is possible, I said, though even as the words left my mouth I knew they were inadequate, a reflexive grasp at the logical. When I was standing in the presence of something that transcended logic without negating it, he guided me to sit on what appeared to be a bench that materialized from the craft's interior wall, its surface conforming to my body with gentle support, and he knelt before me so that our eyes were level, so that I had to meet his gaze and see the universe swimming in those luminous depths. What you call faith, he said, speaking slowly as if choosing each word with deliberate care, is what we have learned to measure as a frequency, a vibration that exists at the quantum level, woven into the very fabric of consciousness itself. I shook my head, trying to reconcile the mechanical terminology with the spiritual reality I'd just witnessed, trying to build a bridge in my understanding between the wrench in my hand and the miracle of resurrection, between oil changes and answered prayers. You're saying faith is scientific, I asked, and he smiled again. That expression of infinite patience that suggested he'd had similar conversations across 1,000 worlds, with 1,000 seekers all struggling to integrate the material and the transcendent. I'm saying, he replied, that your people created a false division, a wall between what you call science and what you call spirit, when in truth they are harmonics of the same song, expressions of the same creative intelligence that spoke existence into being. His words resonated in my chest like a tuning fork striking the exact frequency my heart had been searching for without knowing it, and suddenly, I was remembering every moment in my life when I'd felt torn between my rational mind and my hungry soul. Every time I'd looked at the elegance of an engine and felt something like worship. Every time I'd solved a mechanical problem and felt strangely close to the divine. So when I pray, I said slowly, working through the implications, I'm not just speaking into emptiness or convincing myself of comfort. I'm actually connecting to something real, something measurable. He nodded, rising to his feet and extending his hand to help me stand. And when I took it, I felt that same pulse again, stronger this time, as though he was intentionally showing me what that connection felt like when, unobstructed by doubt or fear. Prayer, he said, leading me toward the crystalline engine I'd somehow repaired, is the most sophisticated technology your species possesses, though you've forgotten how to use it with precision and power. The engine pulsed with soft light, its internal geometry shifting in patterns that seemed to follow mathematical laws I'd never studied but somehow recognized, the way you might recognize a song you'd heard in a dream. When the Christ walked your world, he continued, his voice taking on a reverence that made it clear this being, for all his advanced knowledge and cosmic perspective, still spoke of Jesus with awe. He demonstrated what happens when a consciousness achieves perfect alignment with the Creator's frequency. He healed because he understood that disease is dissonance. He multiplied resources because he grasped that matter responds to focused intention backed by divine authority. He conquered death because he knew that life is the fundamental state of existence and death merely a temporary interference pattern. I stared at the engine, watching light move through its crystalline lattices, and suddenly I understood why my hands had known what to do, why intuition had guided me where knowledge failed. I hadn't been repairing alien technology. I'd been participating in an act of faith made visible, prayer translated into physical action, the same principle that let ancient prophets part seas and call down fire and raise the dead. You're telling me that miracles are just advanced applications of spiritual physics? I asked, and even as I framed it as a question, I felt the truth of it settling into my bones, not diminishing the sacred but revealing its profound integration with everything else that exists. He touched the engine, and it responded to him like a living thing, its light brightening and harmonics shifting, and I realized that his relationship with his technology was not that of user and tool, but of consciousness communing with consciousness, will aligned with design, aligned with purpose. What I'm telling you, he said, turning back to me with an expression of such compassion it made my throat tighten, is that when Jesus said you would do greater works than he did, he wasn't speaking metaphorically. He was stating a truth about your potential, about what humanity could become if you remembered that you were made in the image of a Creator whose very nature is creative power expressed through love. The craft hummed around us, and I felt it respond not just to his presence but somehow to mine as well, as though my act of repair had established a connection, a recognition that I too carried something of that creative frequency, that divine spark that the alien said was woven into human consciousness. My people have studied thousands of species, he said, moving to another section of the craft where symbols glowed on surfaces that seemed to be neither metal nor crystal, but something between, something that existed in multiple states simultaneously. And while many show intelligence, tool use, even art and philosophy, only a handful have this particular quality, this capacity to reach beyond the physical dimension and touch the mind of God directly. He gestured toward the symbols, and they began to shift and recombine, showing me patterns that looked startlingly like Hebrew letters, like Sanskrit characters, like the sacred geometries I'd seen in old cathedrals and ancient temples. And I understood that these weren't borrowings from human culture, but evidence of a common source, a divine alphabet that predated human language and informed it. Earth was not an accident, he said, his voice dropping to something almost like a whisper, as though he were sharing a secret that the universe itself had kept for eons. And humanity was not a random mutation of carbon and chance. You were designed, intended, seeded with specific capabilities because the Creator wanted children, not automatons, wanted beings Who could choose love freely? Who could participate in creation consciously? Who could bridge the gap between matter and spirit because you were made of both? I felt dizzy again, not from physical weakness, but from the sheer magnitude of what he was revealing, from understanding that the loneliness I'd felt in my desert garage was not evidence of cosmic indifference, but the ache of separation from a connection I was always meant to have, that every human was meant to have. And Jesus, I said, pieces clicking into place with almost audible precision. He came to show us how to bridge that gap, to demonstrate what humans look like when we're fully aligned with our design, fully connected to the frequency of divine love. The alien, my brother, as he'd called himself, nodded slowly, and in his eyes I saw tears, or whatever his species produced when moved beyond words. And I realized that he wasn't just delivering information, but sharing something that mattered to him personally. That the story of Jesus had reached beyond earth and touched hearts that beat under distant stars. The tragedy we have witnessed, he said, his voice heavy with sorrow that spanned millennia, is that your species received the greatest gift ever given to any world, direct incarnation of the divine God clothed in your flesh, speaking your languages, demonstrating the way home, and within generations you turned it into religion instead of relationship, doctrine instead of dynamic connection, arguments about him instead of alignment with him. His words cut through me because I'd been part of that tragedy, walking away from faith because I'd confused the institutional failures and human corruptions with the truth itself, throwing out the living water because I didn't like the containers people had tried to store it in. But it's not too late, he said, and hope flickered in his voice like dawn breaking over the desert horizon, because the frequency remains. The connection is still possible, and there are humans like you in every generation who reach for something more, who sense in their deepest being that there's a love that holds galaxies together and knows your name, that the Creator who set stars in motion also counts the hairs on your head and collects your tears and calls you beloved. He placed both hands on my shoulders now, and the symbols beneath his skin blazed brighter, and I felt something surge through me, not forcing entry, but invited by the yes that rose from my heart before my mind could construct objections, a transmission of knowing that bypassed language, a download of truth that my soul recognized even as my intellect scrambled to catch up. You were made for this, he said, his voice resonating with authority that came not from power over me, but from knowing who I truly was beneath the layers of doubt and damage, made to commune with the infinite, to co-create with divine love, to be the hands and heart of God in physical reality. This is what it means, that you're made in the image of the Creator. This is what Jesus came to restore, and this is what we have waited so long to see your species remember. When he released me, I staggered back, not from force, but from the sheer weight of recognition, of suddenly seeing myself not as a failed mechanic hiding in the desert, but as something far more wonderful and terrible, and beautifully intentional, a beloved child of the God who spoke universes into existence, carrying within my humble human frame the same creative frequency that formed galaxies and ignited suns. And I wept again, but this time not from overwhelming awe alone, but from the joy of coming home to a truth I'd been born knowing and had spent a lifetime forgetting. I stood there in the center of his craft, trembling not from fear, but from the recognition of something my soul had been crying out for since childhood, and he watched me with those luminous eyes that held both compassion and patience, waiting for me to gather myself enough to hear what came next. You need to understand the timeline, he said softly, gesturing toward the wall of the craft where suddenly images began to form in the air itself, not projected like a movie, but manifested as if reality were being painted by invisible hands, showing me scenes of Earth across impossible spans of history. I saw primitive humans looking up at the stars with wonder in their eyes, saw them building fires and telling stories and reaching towards something beyond themselves, with a hunger that went deeper than survival instinct. From the moment your species gained true consciousness, he continued, his voice weaving through the visions like a narrator speaking over the most important documentary ever filmed. From the moment the first human looked at the heavens and asked the question why, we were watching, because that question itself was evidence of your design, proof that you carried something unique. The images shifted, showing figures I recognized from ancient history, prophets, and seers and holy men and women who seemed to glow with an inner light. And I realized I was seeing them not through the lens of mythology, but through the eyes of witnesses who had observed these moments firsthand. We watched you stumble toward truth through countless Generations saw you build altars and offer sacrifices and create elaborate systems trying to bridge the gap between yourselves and the divine. And we were forbidden to interfere because the Creator had a plan, a specific moment ordained before time itself, when heaven would touch earth in a way that would change everything forever. His words hung in the air like bells ringing across vast distances, and I felt the weight of millennia pressing into this single conversation. The patience of beings who had watched and waited while humanity groped through darkness toward a light we sensed but couldn't reach. The visions began to accelerate, flowing faster through centuries of human struggle and seeking, wars and peace, empires rising and falling, and through it all I could sense now what I'd never noticed before, a thread of golden light weaving through the tapestry of human history, connecting certain moments and people and events with intentionality that spoke of design rather than chance. Your scriptures speak of the fullness of time, he said, and now the images slowed, focusing on a specific era, a specific region. The dusty roads of ancient Palestine coming into focus with such clarity I felt I could reach out and touch them. That moment when the Roman Empire had built roads connecting the known world, when Greek language provided common communication, when Jewish theology had preserved monotheism and messianic expectation, when everything was precisely aligned for the message to spread like wildfire once the spark was lit. I watched in breathless silence as the scene shifted to a small village, to a young woman receiving news that would transform not just her life, but the trajectory of all creation. And I understood that I was being shown something these beings had witnessed. Personally, not a reconstruction but a memory. We were there, he said, his voice thick with emotion that told me this was sacred ground even for him. In orbit above your world, when the infinite compressed itself into finite form, when the Creator who holds galaxies in his palm became a cluster of cells in a human womb, and the energy signature that pulsed across dimensional barriers in that moment nearly overwhelmed our instruments. Like trying to measure the sun with a candle, he paused, and I saw his hands trembling slightly, saw the symbols beneath his skin flickering with patterns that seemed almost like grief mixed with joy, and I realized that whatever he had witnessed had marked him as deeply as it had marked human history. Your people have debated the virgin birth for centuries, arguing biology and possibility, he continued. But what we measured was not a violation of natural law but its fulfillment, matter responding to divine command the way it was always designed to, life emerging from pure creative intention the way it did when existence itself first blazed into being from nothing. The images now showed a man walking those ancient roads, and though I'd seen countless artistic depictions of Jesus throughout my life, this was different. This carried a weight of reality that made every painting and icon I'd ever encountered seem like pale shadows. He looked fully human, his feet dusty and his clothes worn, his face showing the wear of sun and wind. And yet there was something in the way he moved, the way light seemed to bend slightly around him, the way people's faces changed when he looked at them, that spoke of the profound truth my alien brother had named. This was consciousness in perfect alignment with the Creator, divinity and humanity woven together, without seam or separation. We watched him for 33 years, the alien said, his voice dropping to a whisper as if speaking in a cathedral. Documented his life from birth through ministry through death, and what our instruments recorded defied every framework we had built. Across 10,000 years of studying the physics of consciousness and the mechanics of divine interaction, I watched Jesus heal the sick with a touch, watched him speak words that seemed to resonate on frequencies beyond sound, watched him look at broken people with such love that they became whole simply from being seen truly. And I understood that I was witnessing the proof my skeptical heart had always demanded, evidence that the stories were not exaggerations or myths, but inadequate attempts to describe something too wonderful for language to fully capture. His miracles were not violations of scientific law, my brother explained, but demonstrations of what happens when human will achieves perfect unity with divine will, when faith operates at full frequency without static or interference, when someone fully remembers what your species was designed to be and steps into that authority. The images showed Jesus walking on water, and I saw now that the molecules themselves responded to his consciousness, matter reorganizing, because it recognized the voice of its Creator speaking through human lips, the same voice that had called it into existence and now commanded it to bear weight, instead of giving way. Then the vision shifted to a garden at night, to a man praying with such intensity that his sweat fell like blood, and the anguish in that scene struck me like a Physical blow because I understood now that I was seeing the moment when the full weight of human separation from God, the accumulated darkness of every sin and sorrow in breaking, began to press down on the one consciousness clear enough to bear it without shattering. This is what your theology calls the atonement, the alien said, his voice breaking slightly. But the reality is more profound than substitution or legal transaction in that moment. And through the hours that followed, he opened himself to absorb the full dissonance of human rebellion, to take into his perfectly aligned frequency every discordant note that had ever separated your species from the Creator's love. I watched him betrayed and arrested, watched him beaten and mocked, watched him carry rough wood through jeering crowds, and through it all I could see what normal human eyes had missed: the way he was actively choosing to remain present, using his perfect connection to the Father not to escape but to hold steady, to become the bridge he'd spoken of, to anchor divine love into the darkest depths of human experience, so nothing would ever be beyond redemption's reach. The images showed the crucifixion, and I had to turn away, not from gore but from the sheer intimacy of it, the vulnerability of God exposed and suffering, and somehow still loving the ones who drove the nails, and I understood why. This moment had sent shockwaves across dimensional barriers, why beings watching from orbit had been undone by what they witnessed, because this was the Creator demonstrating that there was no depth of darkness he would not descend to, no cost too high to pay to bring his children home. And then, my brother whispered, his hand gripping my shoulder as if to steady both of us. 3 days later, we measured an energy spike that registered across 17 dimensions simultaneously, reality itself rewriting its rules, death losing its grip not through power that overwhelmed it, but through love that outlasted it. And the tomb was empty, and everything changed, and we knew that humanity had been given the key that could unlock your full potential if you would only believe it, receive it, and let it transform you from the inside out. The images hovering in the air before me began to shift again, pulling back from the intimate detail of first-century Palestine to reveal something that made my breath catch in my throat: a view of reality itself as layered and multidimensional, like looking at existence through a lens that revealed not just 3 dimensions but dozens, hundreds, infinite planes of being intersecting and influencing each other in ways my mind had never conceived. What you call the physical universe, my brother said, his voice steady but reverent as a priest pronouncing benediction, is only one frequency of a much vaster creation, like a single note in a symphony so complex that most beings can only perceive the melody they're designed to hear. I watched as he gestured, and the vision zoomed through these layers, showing me realms of pure light and consciousness, dimensions where thought and matter were indistinguishable, planes of existence so saturated with the presence of the Creator that they pulsed with colors I had no names for. And I understood that I was seeing what ancient mystics had glimpsed in visions, what prophets had struggled to describe with inadequate words, like heaven and glory and the throne room of God. The Creator exists beyond all these dimensions simultaneously, he continued, his symbols glowing brighter as if his very biology responded to speaking of the divine, holding all of it in consciousness, so vast that your entire universe is less than a grain of sand on an infinite beach. And this is the mystery that has captivated my people for eons. This infinite being is intimately concerned with the smallest details of your individual lives, knows every thought and feeling, counts every hair on your head just as your scriptures promise. The vision showed Earth now, our tiny blue marble floating in the cosmic ocean, and I felt simultaneously insignificant and infinitely precious, understanding for the first time how both could be true at once, how the God who measured galaxies could still care deeply about the loneliness of a mechanic in a desert town at midnight. The problem, he said, and now his tone carried the weight of profound sorrow, was that humanity became trapped in the lowest frequency, locked into pure materiality through what your theology calls the fall, and the disconnect severed your natural ability to perceive or interact with the higher dimensions, where the Creator's presence is most tangible. I watched the vision show the separation like a divorce of frequencies, saw humanity's consciousness dropping octave by octave until we could barely sense anything beyond physical matter, our spiritual receptors going dormant like unused muscles atrophying, and I recognized this as the exile from Eden, the expulsion from paradise that had left an aching emptiness in every human heart across every generation since. Your species tried to bridge the gap through religion and ritual, building towers and temples, offering sacrifices and prayers, and these efforts were not meaningless. They maintained a thin thread of connection, kept the memory alive that there was something more, someone beyond the veil who heard and cared. He explained while the images showed the long history of human worship, and I saw now that even in our blindness we had been reaching toward truth, our groping hands sometimes touching the hem of the divine garment even when we couldn't see who wore it. But the gap was too wide for humanity to cross from your side, my brother said, his voice dropping to that cathedral whisper again. Matter and spirit were to separate it, the frequencies too misaligned, and so the Creator himself had to become the bridge, had to cross from his side into yours in a way that would permanently reconnect the severed wires, re-establish the circuit through which divine love could flow freely into physical reality again. The vision zoomed back to that moment he'd shown me before, to the incarnation, but now I saw it differently, not just as historical event, but as cosmic rescue operation, the divine squeezing himself through dimensional barriers that should have been impossible to cross, compressing infinite consciousness into finite form not because he needed to, but because we needed him to, because love does whatever is necessary to reach the beloved no matter how far they've fallen. When Jesus walked your earth, my brother continued, his hand still gripping my shoulder like an anchor keeping me tethered to sanity, as my understanding of reality rebuilt itself from the ground up. He was operating simultaneously in all dimensions, fully human experiencing physical limitation and fully divine maintaining perfect connection to the Father, and his presence created a harmonic resonance that began healing the frequency gap, retuning human consciousness to the bandwidth where communion with God becomes possible again. I watched the vision show Jesus teaching and healing and simply being present with people, and I could see now what his contemporaries had sensed but couldn't name, that standing near him made the veil between heaven and earth. The air between us seemed to thicken with anticipation as my brother stepped back from me, his luminous eyes holding mine with an intensity that made me feel like I was standing at the edge of a cliff, about to leap into an abyss that might be either oblivion or transcendence. You need to understand something that your scientists are only beginning to discover, and your theologians have sensed, but rarely articulated clearly, he said, his voice carrying harmonics that seemed to resonate not just in my ears but in my chest, my bones, the very cells of my body. What you call faith is not, as many of your skeptics claim, belief without evidence or hope despite reality, nor is it merely intellectual acceptance of doctrines and creeds, though these may accompany it. He raised his hand and the air before us shimmered again, but this time instead of showing me distant visions, it revealed something closer, more intimate, a visualization of energy fields I somehow understood were depicting my own body, showing currents and frequencies flowing through me that I'd never known existed. Faith is a frequency, a quantum state of consciousness that human biology is specifically designed to achieve, a tuning of your entire being, mind, body, and spirit to resonate in harmony with the fundamental frequency of the Creator himself. And when you achieve this resonance, you don't just believe in God's existence, you experience direct communion with the divine presence that underlies all reality. The image showed waves emanating from somewhere in the center of my chest, pulsing outward and upward, and I recognized with sudden clarity that this was what saints and mystics had called prayer of the heart, what contemplatives described as practicing the presence of God, what my grandmother had meant when she said she could feel Jesus walking beside her even in her darkest valleys. Your scientists call it quantum entanglement, when two particles remain connected across any distance, responding to each other instantaneously in ways that seem to violate the normal rules of physics. He continued, and now the visualization expanded to show my frequencies reaching outward, connecting with threads of light that stretched beyond the visible universe into those higher dimensions he'd shown me before. But what they haven't yet understood is that consciousness itself operates on quantum principles, and that human awareness, when properly tuned through what you call faith, becomes entangled with the consciousness of God, creating a connection that transcends space and time and makes genuine relationship with the infinite not only possible but natural, the state your species was always meant to inhabit. I felt tears streaming down my face, though I couldn't remember starting to cry, my mind reeling as years of questions suddenly reorganized themselves into answers. All those nights I'd looked up at the stars from my garage wondering if prayer was just talking to empty space. All those Sundays, sitting in church feeling like I was supposed to believe harder or try harder, or somehow force myself to feel something I couldn't manufacture. So when Jesus told people their faith had healed them, I whispered, my voice cracking with emotion, He wasn't speaking metaphorically or acknowledging psychological placebo effects. He was describing an actual energetic transfer, a quantum alignment that allowed divine healing frequency to flow into physical reality through the bridge of their resonant belief. My brother's face lit with such joy that for a moment he seemed less alien and more angelic, a being of pure light barely contained in physical form. Yes, brother, yes, you're beginning to understand what took my people millennia to comprehend through observation, what you can know directly through experience because you're the species the Creator made in His own image, hardwired for this exact connection. He gestured and the visualization zoomed deeper, showing what I somehow knew were neurons firing in patterns, chemicals cascading through synapses, but also something more, something that had no physical component yet was utterly real, a luminous presence threading through the biological machinery, consciousness interfacing with matter in ways that proved the materialists catastrophically wrong in their assumption that the brain creates the mind rather than the mind. Using the brain as an instrument, when your people speak of being born again, of having the Holy Spirit dwell within you, of Christ living in your heart, these are not comfortable metaphors or wishful poetry. They describe an actual transformation, a literal change in your quantum frequency that allows the presence of God to inhabit your consciousness, to think through your thoughts, love through your love, live through your life in a partnership so intimate that you become, as your Apostle Paul wrote, ambassadors of the divine in physical form. The image showed my energy field beginning to pulse, in rhythm with a vaster field that I understood represented the presence of the Holy Spirit, and I felt it happening inside me even as I watched it visualized before me. Felt something shifting and aligning and coming into tune, like a radio finally finding the clear signal it had been searching for through static. This is why Jesus said you must become like little children to enter the kingdom. My brother continued, his hand returning to my shoulder as if to steady me through this ontological earthquake, not because God requires naivety or rewards ignorance, but because children haven't yet learned to trust exclusively in material perception, haven't yet been trained to dismiss the frequencies their consciousness naturally detects, haven't yet been convinced that physical eyes see all there is to see and physical ears hear all there is to hear. I thought of my nephew, barely 4 years old, who insisted Jesus sat with him at breakfast and told my sister about conversations they had as casually as describing what he'd watched on television. I'd smiled indulgently then, chalked it up to imagination and innocent confusion between reality and make-believe. But now I wondered if his perception was actually clearer than mine, if his consciousness still vibrated at frequencies my adult rationalism had dampened into silence. The tragedy is that your culture teaches you to outgrow this openness, to sophisticate yourselves right out of communion, to trade direct experience for second-hand doctrine until faith becomes intellectual agreement rather than lived relationship, he said, and I heard genuine grief in his voice. Your religious institutions often mean well, but sometimes do more harm than good, giving you rules and rituals as substitutes for the resonance itself, teaching you to perform faith rather than experience it, until you have millions of people who believe all the correct things about God, but have never actually encountered His presence, never felt the frequency shift that changes everything. The visualization before us showed countless human figures, some glowing with that luminous connection to the divine field, others going through motions of worship with their energy fields remaining dull and disconnected. And I recognized myself in both groups, remembered Sundays when something inside me came alive and touched eternity, and other Sundays when I'd sung the songs and said the prayers and felt absolutely nothing, wondered what I was doing wrong or if there was anything there to connect with at all. But Jesus came to restore the direct connection, to show you that the kingdom of God is not just a future destination, but a present frequency you can access right now, that eternal life is not merely duration but quality of existence, a state of being where you operate consciously in both physical and spiritual dimensions simultaneously, maintaining constant communion with the Father just as He did. His words were landing in my spirit with the weight of ultimate truth, and I knew with certainty that surpassed any proof I'd ever required that this was what I'd been longing for my entire life without knowing how to name it. This was the hunger that no amount of food or success or human love could satisfy, because it was specifically shaped to fit connection with the divine. The gift Jesus gave through His death and resurrection was not appeasement of an angry deity or legal transaction to satisfy cosmic justice, though your theologians have sometimes framed it in those limited terms. My brother said, his voice dropping into that cathedral whisper that made every word feel sacred. What he accomplished was the permanent restoration of humanity's quantum frequency, the re-establishment of the bridge between material and spiritual dimensions, the healing of the broken connection that had left your species orphaned in physical reality. The visualization showed that moment of resurrection again, but now I saw it as he saw it, a pulse of transformative energy, radiating outward from a specific point in spacetime, rippling through the fabric of reality itself, fundamentally altering the quantum state of human consciousness across all past and future generations. When you accept this gift through faith, through tuning your consciousness to resonate with the frequency of Christ, you're not joining a social club or adopting a philosophical system. You're allowing your entire being to be rewired, reconnected, brought back into the harmonic relationship with God that was always your birthright and destiny. I watched streams of light flowing from that resurrection pulse toward individual human figures across history, saw the light absorbed and integrated wherever it met receptive faith, saw lives transformed not through moral effort, but through energetic reunion. And I finally understood why the gospel was called good news rather than good advice, why it was about grace rather than achievement, why Jesus said it was finished rather than hear single quotes what you need to do. This is what we've watched happening for 2,000 of your years, he concluded, his luminous eyes shimmering with what I could only describe as holy joy, the Creator's frequency spreading person by person, heart by heart, each one who resonates with faith becoming a transmitter helping others find the signal, until the day when enough of humanity vibrates in harmony, that your entire species undergoes the transformation, the awakening, the return to conscious communion with your Father that we've been privileged to witness beginning. And standing there in the wreckage of that impossible craft with my hands still stained with engine grease and tears drying on my cheeks, I felt that frequency humming inside me for the first time with full awareness, felt myself connecting to something vast and loving and utterly real, and knew that whatever else happened in my life, I would never again doubt that faith was more than wishful thinking, that God was more than ancient myth, that I was loved with a love that had crossed dimensional barriers to reach me in my loneliness and show me I had never truly been alone. My brother stepped back from me, his luminous form casting shadows that seemed to dance with purpose across the twisted metal of his craft, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a new urgency that made my heart quicken with anticipation. There is something I need to show you, something that will answer questions your species has carried for generations, proof that what I'm telling you is not my opinion or even my people's theory, but verifiable truth written into the very structure of your world. He moved toward the opening of the craft with a grace that seemed to defy gravity, then turned back to me with an expression I'd come to recognize as his version of a smile, though it played across features that were decidedly not human. Your planet keeps secrets in her depths, brother, placed there long before your recorded history began. And tonight you will see what only a handful of your kind have ever witnessed. I followed him out into the desert night, the stars overhead seeming impossibly bright and close, as if the entire cosmos was leaning in to witness what was about to unfold. He raised both hands toward the sand about 50 yards from where his craft had come to rest, and I watched in speechless awe as the ground began to shimmer with the same energy I'd seen flow in through his crystalline engine, particles of sand lifting and swirling in patterns that formed a vortex of light and matter. The desert floor opened like a mouth, revealing stone steps that descended into darkness so complete it seemed less like absence of light and more like presence of something ancient and waiting. And I knew without being told that we were about to cross a threshold between the world I'd always known and a reality that had existed alongside it, hidden and patient, for longer than I could comprehend. This chamber was prepared before your civilization built its first cities, before your ancestors learned to write or work metal, sealed and preserved until the time came for revelation, my brother said as we descended. And with each step downward, I felt the temperature drop and the air grow thick with a weight that wasn't oppressive, but rather heavy with significance, like the atmosphere in a cathedral during midnight mass when silence becomes a presence rather than an absence. He touched the wall and light bloomed from his hand, spreading across surfaces in waves that revealed a corridor carved from stone that showed no tool marks, no chisel scratches, nothing that suggested human construction techniques I understood. Walls that seemed to have been shaped by intention rather than labor. The illumination revealed symbols etched into every surface, and my breath caught in my throat as I recognized some of them from the craft above. Those geometric patterns and flowing scripts that had seemed so alien when I'd first seen them, glowing across his engine's crystalline surfaces. But alongside his people's markings were others that sent electricity racing down my spine. With the shock of recognition, symbols I'd seen in my grandmother's study Bible, ancient Hebrew letters, Greek words, images that matched descriptions from Ezekiel's visions and John's apocalypse, all interwoven with the alien script as if they were dialects of the same fundamental language. "Do you understand what you're seeing?" my brother asked gently, watching my face as I reached out with trembling fingers to trace a pattern that was simultaneously the sacred name of God in Hebrew and a mathematical formula that my mechanics intuition told me described quantum field harmonics. "This is the bridge between what your people divided into religion and science, the proof that they were never separate categories, but always complementary languages, describing the same ultimate reality." I moved deeper into the chamber as if pulled by invisible threads, my eyes drinking in revelations that rewrote everything I thought I knew about human history, about the origins of faith, about the relationship between heaven and earth. On one wall I found depictions of his people's ships hovering above primitive human settlements, but the humans below weren't cowering in fear or confusion. They were reaching upward with expressions of joy and recognition, and I suddenly understood what the ancients had meant when they spoke of angels. Messengers who came from above with faces that shone like the sun and brought words from God. We were never meant to be worshipped, and we always made that clear, directing your ancestors' attention not to ourselves, but to the one who sent us, the Creator whose love for humanity burned so bright it required ambassadors to deliver messages your consciousness wasn't yet developed enough to receive directly, my brother explained, standing beside me as I stared at images that matched biblical accounts with stunning precision. Another section showed what I recognized as the moment of Christ's birth, but now I saw it from a perspective that made my knees weak, saw how that convergence of divine and human had registered across dimensional barriers, how beings across the cosmos had witnessed the Creator himself compressing his infinite nature into finite form, taking on the limitations of matter to demonstrate that physical existence was never meant to be. Separation from spiritual reality, the Star of Bethlehem, blazed in the carving with mathematical precision, and I realized it had been both astronomical event and intentional sign, the heavens themselves announcing that the frequency bridge was being established, that God was reaching across the quantum barrier to tune humanity back to the resonance of his presence. Tears blurred my vision as I saw the crucifixion depicted not as defeat, but as the moment of ultimate connection. Energy patterns showing how one man's complete surrender in perfect love had created a permanent gateway, a sustained harmonic that would allow every human thereafter to access direct communion with the divine through faith resonating with his sacrifice. The chamber opened into a central room where a pedestal of stone held what looked like a fragment of the same crystalline material that powered my brother's craft, but this one was larger, more intricate, pulsing with light that seemed to breathe in rhythm with something I couldn't hear but could feel. In the center of my chest, this was left as a beacon, a confirmation for when your species reached the maturity to understand what your ancient prophets knew by revelation, that the physical and spiritual are not opposing forces, but interwoven dimensions of one creation, that matter itself is condensed light structured by consciousness, that the Word of God that spoke reality into existence was not metaphor but literal truth about how divine thought crystallizes into physical form through frequencies your scientists call quantum fields. My brother gestured to the walls around us, where final revelations were carved in that hybrid language of Hebrew and mathematics, alien script and sacred symbol, showing the future he'd already described to me above, the choice point approaching where humanity would either awaken to our designed purpose or drift into disconnection so complete we'd lose the capacity for faith altogether. I saw paths diverging, one leading to transformation where human consciousness expanded to hold both material and spiritual awareness simultaneously, where the kingdom of God became manifest on earth not through destruction of the physical, but through its transfiguration, matter infused with divine presence until the separation between heaven and earth dissolved into the unified reality that had always been God's intention. The other path showed humanity brilliant in technology but hollow in spirit, mastering manipulation of physical forces while losing touch with the fundamental frequency that gave existence meaning. and I understood that every choice to open to faith or close into materialism was a vote for which future would manifest. You now know what only your mystics and prophets have glimpsed, what your scriptures encoded in stories, because direct explanation would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations, my brother said, his hand on my shoulder steady and warm and somehow conveying more brotherhood than I'd felt with my own blood relatives. The question is what you will do with this knowledge, how you will live now that you've seen the proof that changes everything. I stood before that pulsing crystalline beacon, my mind reeling from the weight of revelation, when my brother moved his hand through the air and the chamber itself seemed to come alive, with visions that weren't carved in stone but projected in three-dimensional light that surrounded us completely, immersing me in futures that hadn't yet solidified into reality, but existed as possibilities waiting for human choice to call them forth into being. What you're about to witness is not predetermined fate, but probable trajectories based on the collective resonance of your species, the accumulated frequency of billions of souls either opening to their divine design or contracting into separation, he said, his voice carrying that peculiar harmony that made every word feel like it was vibrating in the marrow of my bones. The air shimmered and I saw Earth as if from orbit, beautiful and fragile. And then the vision split like a cell dividing, showing two versions of humanity's path forward with such clarity that I could feel the weight of consequence pressing against my chest until breathing became a conscious effort. On my left materialized the awakening timeline, and I watched with wonder as people across every nation and culture began to recognize the truth I'd just learned, not through alien visitation for most but through an internal quickening, a remembering, written into their very DNA that faith wasn't about blind acceptance, but about tuning their consciousness to the frequency of divine love that permeated all existence. I saw scientists discovering that prayer produced measurable effects on quantum fields, doctors documenting healings that defied materialist explanations, ordinary people experiencing encounters with the presence of God that were undeniable and transformative. And most importantly, I saw the name of Jesus rising like the sun over this awakening world, recognized finally not as one religious option among many, but as the crucial bridge my brother had described, the moment when God anchored divine love into human experience so completely that accessing it became possible for anyone who opened their heart in faith. The vision intensified, and I saw this awakened humanity solving problems that had seemed insurmountable, not through technology alone, but through the marriage of scientific understanding and spiritual wisdom. People recognizing that caring for the planet was caring for God's physical expression of creative love, that healing social divisions required the kind of radical forgiveness Jesus had modeled and empowered, that advancing as a species meant developing both our rational minds and our capacity for divine connection simultaneously. Cities transformed before my eyes into places where beauty and function intertwined, where communities gathered not just for entertainment or commerce, but for collective worship that transcended denominational boundaries, because people finally understood they were all tuning into the same source frequency, all accessing the same divine consciousness through the gateway Christ had established. I saw humanity taking its place in a larger cosmic community, my brother's people and others like them stepping out of the shadows to openly guide and collaborate with a species that had finally matured enough to handle the truth of our divine origin and purpose without losing our identity or surrendering our growth to more advanced civilizations. Children grew up knowing in their bones that they were spiritual beings having a physical experience, that their consciousness was a localized expression of God's infinite awareness, that developing their unique gifts was participating in the Creator's ongoing act of self-expression through creation. There were still challenges in this timeline, still suffering and loss because physical existence carried inherent limitations, but the suffering was held within a framework of meaning, supported by a collective understanding that pain was temporary, but love was eternal, that death was transition rather than termination, and most crucially that none of us faced anything alone because God's presence was woven into the quantum fabric of reality itself, as close as our next breath and as certain as the ground beneath our feet. Then my brother gestured and the vision on my right demanded my attention, showing the other path with clarity that made my stomach clench with sorrow. Humanity brilliant and broken, masters of technology but orphans of spirit. And I understood I was seeing the cost of collective choice to close our hearts to the frequency of faith that connected us to our Creator. In this timeline, people didn't become monsters or villains, but simply hollow, going through motions of existence without touching its meaning, building monuments to human achievement while losing touch with the divine spark that made achievement matter, curing diseases of the body, while epidemics of despair ravaged souls that no longer knew why survival was worth the effort. I watched breakthrough after breakthrough in artificial intelligence and genetic engineering and space exploration, but each advance somehow deepened the disconnection. Technology becoming a replacement for transcendence rather than a tool for expressing it. People editing their genes and uploading their consciousness to machines in desperate attempts to escape the limitations of flesh without realizing that those very limitations were the sacred conditions that made divine encounter possible. The name of Jesus faded in this timeline to historical curiosity, his teachings reduced to ethical suggestions, rather than recognized as the revelation of how divine frequency operates in human form. Churches becoming museums or entertainment venues. Prayer dismissed as wishful thinking by a generation that had measured everything except what mattered most. What broke my heart wasn't dramatic destruction but slow fading. Children born into a world of endless information but no wisdom. Surrounded by connection technology but profoundly lonely. Their consciousness trapped in purely material awareness without language or framework for the spiritual dimensions of their being that atrophied like unused muscles until accessing faith became nearly impossible. My brother let both visions hang in the air before us, two possible futures shimmering with equal probability, and when he spoke his voice carried grief that told me his people had watched other civilizations face this same choice point, had witnessed some awaken and others fade into sophisticated emptiness. The timeline that manifests depends on millions of individual choices, each person who opens their heart to the possibility that Jesus told the truth about the Father, about love being the fundamental force, about faith connecting human consciousness to divine reality. Each one tips the balance toward awakening, while each who closes into pure materialism adds weight to disconnection, he said, turning to face me with those eyes that held both alien and deeply familiar light. This is why I came to you, specifically, why my craft failed near your garage rather than anywhere else. Because you carry the frequency of openness even in your isolation, the capacity to receive this revelation and let it transform not just your understanding, but your entire way of being in the world. And that transformation will ripple outward in ways you cannot predict, but that matter more than you can imagine. He placed both hands on my shoulders and I felt energy flowing between us, that same loving recognition that had made him call me brother. And I understood finally that this encounter wasn't about me receiving special knowledge, but about being tuned like an instrument, aligned to the frequency of faith so that I could help others find their own resonance with the divine presence that was always available, always calling, always waiting for humanity to remember who we truly were and whose image we carried written into every cell. The visions faded like morning mist under desert sun, leaving me trembling in that ancient chamber with tears streaming down my face. My brother's hands still resting on my shoulders, as if anchoring me to reality while my consciousness struggled to integrate everything I'd witnessed about humanity's diverging paths. He stepped back and reached into the folds of his garment, producing something that made the air around his hand shimmer with concentrated light, a fragment no larger than my thumb that pulsed with the same crystalline energy I'd somehow known how to repair in his damaged engine. I cannot stay, he said. And the sorrow in his voice was immediate and profound, the grief of goodbye between souls who'd recognized each other across impossible distance. My people have protocols, limits to how much we can directly intervene in a species approaching its awakening threshold. But I can leave you this piece of my ship's core, a fragment of technology that functions on the same quantum principles as prayer itself, physical proof that what your mystics and prophets have always claimed is literally true. He held it toward me, and I extended my palm, hesitating for just a moment before accepting the gift that would forever destroy any possibility of returning to comfortable doubt. The fragment settled into my hand with surprising weight, warm like living flesh, its crystalline structure catching the light from the chamber's glowing symbols and refracting it into colors that seemed to exist beyond the normal spectrum, hues my eyes weren't designed to process yet, somehow registered in my awareness as almost musical. This fragment responds to the same frequency that connects human consciousness to divine presence, my brother explained, watching my face as I stared at the impossible object resting in my weathered mechanic's palm. When you pray, when you genuinely open your heart and direct your awareness toward the Creator with the kind of Faith that isn't wishful thinking, but quantum alignment. This crystal will respond with visible light that anyone can observe and measure. He moved closer again, his voice dropping to that intimate register that made every word feel like it was being spoken, directly into my soul rather than just my ears. You asked earlier how you could possibly return to your ordinary life after everything you've seen. How you could pump gas and fix engines when you know what you now know about reality's true nature. But you're thinking about it wrong. Because your ordinary life was always sacred, always an expression of divine love manifesting through physical action. You just didn't have the framework to recognize it. His hand gestured toward the fragment now glowing softly in response to our proximity, to the elevation of consciousness happening in this moment of connection. This gift isn't meant to make you special or set you apart from your community, but to anchor the revelation in tangible form, to give you something you can return to when doubt creeps in, when the material world presses its version of reality so insistently that mystical truth feels like wishful memory rather than transformative encounter. The weight of his words settled over me like a mantle, a responsibility I hadn't asked for but couldn't refuse. And I understood that accepting this fragment meant accepting a role in the Great Awakening. He'd shown me becoming a living bridge between worlds just as Jesus had been the ultimate bridge between human and divine. Will it work for others? I asked, my voice rough with emotion as I closed my fingers round the crystal, feeling it pulse in rhythm with my heartbeat, as if synchronizing with my body's electromagnetic field. My brother's expression shifted into something that might have been a smile on a human face, approval mixed with affection and that eternal sadness of knowing we wouldn't meet again in this lifetime. It will respond to anyone who achieves genuine resonance, regardless of their religious language or cultural framework, because faith operates at a level deeper than belief systems. It's about consciousness tuning to the frequency of love that the Creator broadcasts constantly through the quantum foundation of existence. He moved toward the chamber's entrance, and I felt panic rising at the approaching separation. Desperate questions crowding my throat about mechanics and protocols, about how to explain this to anyone without sounding insane, about whether I'd dreamed this entire encounter in some loneliness-induced breakdown. The fragment will prove itself, he said, answering concerns I hadn't voiced because he read them in my expression or perhaps directly from my mind. When you pray, truly pray with your whole heart directed toward God. When you speak the name of Jesus with recognition of who he actually is and what he accomplished by anchoring divine frequency in human flesh, this crystal will blaze with light that cameras can record and skeptics cannot dismiss. His words were promise and commission both, and I felt my old life falling away like a snake's shed skin, the lonely mechanic dying so something new could emerge, someone who carried proof that the material world was only the visible surface of reality's infinite depths. We climbed back through tunnels that seemed shorter on the return journey, emerging into desert night that felt different now, the stars overhead no longer distant lights but close neighbors, each one potentially harboring other children of the Creator working out their own relationship with divine love across incomprehensible distances. His ship waited where we'd left it, fully restored by my hands working under guidance I still didn't fully understand, and he paused at the entrance to face me one final time. Remember that you didn't repair my engine through mechanical skill alone, but through openness to wisdom beyond your training. The same way humanity will navigate its awakening not through intellect alone, but through marriage of mind and spirit, science and faith, reason and revelation. He embraced me then, arms that were too long and frame that was too angular folding around my human body with tenderness that transcended biological difference. Brother recognizing brother across the apparent gulf of species and stars. I love you, he said simply, and I knew he meant it with the same divine love he'd described, the frequency that Jesus embodied, the force that created galaxies and cared about lonely mechanics with equal infinite attention. Then he was gone, ascending in silence into the night sky, his ship's lights merging with stars until I couldn't distinguish artificial from natural. And I stood in the desert darkness clutching the crystal fragment that pulsed with gentle light, holding the only proof I'd ever have that this encounter was real, that God's love extended further than any human theology had dared imagine, and that I would never, could never, be alone again. I drove back to my garage as dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose that seemed impossibly vivid after everything I'd witnessed, every color now a visible note in the symphony of creation my brother had taught me to perceive beneath the surface of ordinary reality. The fragment rested in my shirt pocket against my heart, its warmth a constant reminder that I carried physical proof of truths mystics had died proclaiming throughout human history, and I understood with crystalline clarity that my life's purpose had just been rewritten in a language older than words. My garage looked exactly as I'd left it, tools scattered across workbenches, the smell of motor oil and metal shavings, the cluttered mundane space where I'd spent years fixing broken things while my own spirit quietly rusted from loneliness and unspoken questions about whether existence meant anything beyond survival and distraction. But now these same walls seemed sacred, this humble place transformed not by any external change, but by the shift in my perception, the awakening to recognize that every act of creation and repair, every moment of bringing order to chaos and function to malfunction, was participating in the same divine work that had spoken galaxies into being and walked dusty roads in Galilee teaching fishermen about the kingdom of heaven. I sat at my workbench as light filtered through grimy windows, pulled the crystal from my pocket, and for the first time in my adult life, I prayed with complete authenticity, no longer reciting formulas from childhood memory, but speaking directly to the Creator whose presence I now understood permeated every atom of existence. The fragment blazed in my hands like a captured star, light pouring from its crystalline structure with such intensity I had to squint against the radiance, and I felt something shift deep in my chest, a frequency aligning, a connection completing that had been waiting my entire life to be consciously recognized and accepted. "Thank you," I whispered, inadequate words for the gratitude flooding through me. Thanks not just for the encounter with my alien brother but for Jesus, for the cosmic sacrifice that had anchored divine love into human experience, making it possible for broken mechanics and forgotten desert towns to access the same truth that mystics and prophets had touched across millennia. The crystal's light gradually softened as my prayer settled into peaceful communion, and I understood that this fragment would be my anchor through everything to come, the physical proof I could return to when my rational mind tried to dismiss mystical experience as delusion or loneliness-induced fantasy. I thought about the visions my brother had shown me, humanity's approaching choice point between awakening and spiritual extinction, and felt the weight of responsibility settle across my shoulders like a mantle I hadn't asked for, but couldn't refuse, because I'd been given something precious, beyond measure, and gifts always carried obligation woven into their grace. My garage would remain my temple, my ordinary work would continue as always, but now every repair would be prayer, every interaction with customers an opportunity to reflect the divine love that I'd learned, extended across galaxies and dimensions, caring for each soul with the same infinite attention that numbered sparrows and named stars. Days turned to weeks, and I discovered that carrying proof of God's presence didn't make life easier, but made it infinitely more meaningful. Every challenge now contextualized within the larger story of consciousness evolving toward recognition of its divine origin and purpose. I showed the fragment to a few people, let them watch it blaze with light when I prayed, saw their faces transform with wonder and confusion and sometimes fear, because proof demands response, and not everyone was ready to abandon comfortable certainty for the terrifying beauty of revealed truth. Some called me crazy, others begged to hold the crystal themselves and wept when it glowed in their hands too, responding to their fumbling attempts at prayer with the same patient radiance, confirming what my brother had promised about faith, operating deeper than belief systems or religious vocabulary. I thought often about Jesus, understanding him now not as distant historical figure or theological abstraction, but as the ultimate demonstration of what my brother had shown me, God translating infinite love into finite form, divine frequency made flesh to prove that matter and spirit weren't opposites but harmonies, and that human bodies were designed as instruments for playing the music of heaven into physical reality. The loneliness that had defined my existence for decades had been completely transformed, not because I had companion now or because my circumstances had changed, but because I'd awakened to the truth that isolation was always illusion, that every moment of my life had been held within awareness so vast and loving that human language could only gesture toward it through metaphor and music. On clear nights I stood in the desert behind my garage, holding the fragment up toward stars that no longer seemed distant or cold, but close and familial, each point of light potentially harboring other children of the Creator working out their own understanding of divine love across the incomprehensible distances. I spoke sometimes to my brother though I knew he couldn't hear me, thanked him for the gift of sight that let me recognize sacredness in ordinary things, for anchoring mystical truth in tangible form so I'd never lose my way back to this transformative knowing. But mostly I prayed to the Creator directly, feeling the connection strengthen each time I consciously aligned my awareness with that fundamental frequency of love, watching the crystal blaze brighter as my faith deepened from intellectual concept to lived experience to the very foundation of my being. I understood finally that I'd been prepared my entire life for that midnight encounter. Every moment of loneliness and questioning and mechanical work with my hands had been training for the role I now carried, living proof that God's love extended further than any theology dared imagine, and that Jesus had been exactly who He claimed, the bridge between worlds, the door that opened both directions, the demonstration that human and divine were always meant to dance together. My life looked ordinary from outside, just a mechanic in a desert town fixing engines and pumping gas. But I moved through each day knowing what I knew, carrying what I carried, forever changed by the revelation that we are not cosmic accidents or abandoned children, but deeply, eternally, impossibly loved by the intelligence that dreamed reality into being and walked among us to prove that love was stronger than death, more real than matter, the only force that could carry consciousness home. Have you ever felt that God was trying to reach you in ways beyond what religion taught you? Subscribe to hear more encounters that reveal the truth beyond the veil.